Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. Great. So on my left we have Ivan. Some of you locals will recognize Ivan Castleman. He's currently doing his PhD on the phylogeny and phytochemistry of Salvia divinorum, which is a psychoactive plant from Mexico. Ivan has a strong understanding of chemistry, biomedicine, and social models of psychoactive use. So thanks for joining us, Ivan. And next we have Torsten Wiedemann. Torsten's a very well-known figure in the Australian ethnobotanical scene. On a number of occasions, he has lobbied successfully for legislation to be altered, allowing citizens to access medicinal plants. So his knowledge of the processes through which these kinds of things take place is very far-reaching. Thanks for joining us, Torsten. We've also got Damon Adams. Damon has seen the war on drugs from both sides of the fence, having served as a police officer and now as Vice President of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. He's an advocate for the use of medical cannabis. Not only that, he tells me his mother's a pharmacist, so he may have some additional insight from that side of the fence. Thanks for joining us, Damon. Next we have Dr. Alex Wodak, perhaps the foremost figure in the Australian drug law reform movement. Alex, of course, is very well known for his work in the sphere of harm reduction and with a number of political and medical bodies. So we're very glad to have him here today. Thank you very much for joining us, Alex. And we have also Andrew Cavasilas, highly engaged in the Australian hemp and medical cannabis growers movement for the last 15 years. You might know that in 2001, in conjunction with Dr. Andrew Catalaris, he grew 20 high THC plants at Southern Cross University under license from the government. Andrew is very knowledgeable about international precedents in the field of medical cannabis and how they relate to our situation here in Australia. So thanks for joining us also, Andrew. So to start off with, I'd like to invite the audience to give us a show of hands. Have any of you suffered or any of you suffering from an illness for which medical cannabis is considered useful? There's quite a few. How many of you are carers or know somebody who is suffering or has suffered from an illness? Is there anyone here who would like to have the legal right to grow medicinal cannabis? And is there anyone who feels like they've been negatively impacted by the prohibition of cannabis? I think that's 99.9%. Okay. So we'll spend hopefully about 20 minutes on audience questions after the discussion, so please keep your questions till the end. Thanks. So let's start with Dr. Wodak. Alex, as a medical doctor, could you please comment on the ways in which a medicine which people can grow in their backyards might work within a paradigm within which doctors prescribe treatments to their patients?
Okay, I think it's very important when we're discussing any subject, but particularly this subject, that we start at the other end and we are very clear about what we want to achieve. Because it's only when we're clear about what we want to achieve that can we really have a useful discussion about how to achieve those objectives and what the options are and what the criteria should be for choosing between the options. And in all medical interventions, and I'm using medicine here in a broad sense to cover everything in medicine, there really are three clear objectives, and they are effectiveness, safety, and cost effectiveness. Now, that really doesn't change when you're thinking about this from a perspective or the patient perspective. We all want medicines that we take to be effective in relieving the symptoms that we are suffering from, or better still, in curing the underlying disease that we are suffering from. In terms of safety, again, we all want the medicines we are taking not to cause additional problems, or if they do cause additional health problems, we want those to be much, much less serious than the benefits they provide. And that's a critical component of this as well. In the case of medicinal cannabis, we need to think not only of the side effects being potential health hazards, but also potential legal hazards. So we want to make sure that that if we're taking a medicine, that we're not going to put ourselves or our loved ones at any risk of having legal serious legal consequences or even any legal consequences. And on the question of cost, we all want medicines to be affordable, and that's a very important consideration. It's always an important consideration, and it's particularly important in the case of medicinal cannabis because many of the people who will want to take medicinal cannabis will have been quite sick for some years and will have very low incomes or have very low savings. Most of their savings will have gone. I don't see the day when medicinal cannabis will be subsidised either by a federal government or a state or territory government. Well, perhaps I could keep going and finish this, and then by all means, let's have an interaction. I'm trying to spell out a framework that we can usefully discuss this. Another aspect of safety that comes into this is the usefulness of regulation. And regulation of medicines has grown over the years, and in my view, for good reason. And the safety of the medicines we take is considered in public health as similar to, in importance to having safe water supply, safe food supply, and being able to breathe safe air. It's a very fundamental part of public health. In the days of the Wild West, the snake oil salesman, anything went, and people sold medicines that were sometimes ineffective, sometimes dangerous as well as being ineffective, and so a regulatory system has grown up. It's not perfect, it's better than it was, there are still problems with it. And we've all been seared by the experience of thalidomide in the early 1960s, and nobody wants to see a repeat of that. And so the system is quite risk averse. I think we have to bear in mind the fact, I'm sorry this is taking a bit long, I'm almost finished. The system has to take into account the fact that people are very easily able to grow the plant themselves and realistically can't be stopped, and we all know that. And so the more restrictive the system is, the more people will produce their own plant. And the problem I have with that is that some people are too ill to grow their own plants, some people don't have the facilities, the soil or the sunlight to grow their own plants, or the skills that are needed. And so and whilst I think it's unrealistic to try and remove that option, I don't think we should force people into that being the only option available. So I would always like to see a regulated supply, and the greater the proportion of the market that is provided by the regulated system, from my perspective, the better. But I appreciate that's never going to be complete. And the sorts of things that I would want to see in the regulated market is that we would know exactly what is in what the patient is consuming, and we'd also know what isn't in the medicine that's provided. That is, that the proportion of rare metals will be below a certain level, the proportion of bacteria will be below a certain level, the proportion of other microbiological contamination will be below levels that are considered to be worrying. So there's a whole system that would be developed. Personally, I'm not particularly fussed as to who provides the stuff, as long as that person is, or the providers have a license and are considered person of good character, or organisations of good character, and that we have a system of regularly monitoring the performance. Of course, I would also like to see, as with other medicines, that there is a monitoring of the effectiveness and safety of the medicines. So that's a broad outline in terms of the supply of medicines. There are many options. I don't care too much which of those we have, as long as we have medicines which are effective, safe and affordable.
Thank you very much, Dr. Woodard. Andrew, could you please fill us in on some relevant points about how the cultivation and dispensation of medical cannabis works in other countries and what we can learn from them?
Well, yeah, it's a really interesting thing that, I'd like to talk about. Again, the other countries and what we perceive to be going on in other countries. Generally, Australia is in the same boat as most everybody else in the world who are trying to get medical cannabis for use. And in order for us to call it medical cannabis in the sense that it's something that's prescribable, and you go to a doctor, it's something that, I mean, we're all talking here from an angle of we're in this 1%, maybe 2% of people who can know about cannabis. We do know medical benefits from it. We do have access to it. We can grow it. But by and large, we're looking at about 98% of the people who would benefit from medical cannabis at the moment don't. They don't even know they need it. They're stuck in that medical realm of going to a doctor, getting a prescription. So in order for us and other countries to say, all right, well, they are doing medical cannabis, you have to look at it in terms of that. Now, for instance, we'll start off with the US, those states in the US. That's not happening there. So whether you want to call what they're doing over there medical cannabis, and for us to be trying to achieve that level of medical cannabis, I don't know whether that's acceptable. You're looking over there where each of those states, what really happened, all of those state governments opposed medical cannabis. They were citizens-initiated referendums. The governments ran no campaigns. They got extra money from the federal government, the US government, to run no narratives. Medical cannabis did get up, but they did not willingly. The governments didn't want them. So there's no research being done. There's no access for that medical cannabis regimes in those states. They don't have access to universities or labs that can conduct medical trials and try and get cannabis to that maybe 90 or 80% in some of those states. There's still no situation where you can go to a doctor, get a prescription, go to the pharmacy and get your standardised medical cannabis dose. It's known. And so for us, we really have to understand that we're part of this, couple of percent who do have access. We can't see the logic in having, this standardisation, this, refinement, these clinical trials. But that's how it is, guys, and that's how it is, and that's how it is. So that's what's happening in the US. Whether we want to strive for that kind of regime, I don't think so in the long run. We probably, need to find that kind of a pharmaceuticalisation. Now, whether it's done by big pharma or lots of different companies, growing their own under controlled conditions and producing particular products for particular conditions, that's something for the future. That's in the US. In Canada, much the same. We're a member of the same Commonwealth, but they have a Bill of Rights over there, and their court system works a bit different. There was a couple of court cases over there which went to the High Court, and on the grounds of medical necessity, the appeals were upheld, and in layman's term, the court ordered the government to introduce a medical cannabis regime, and gave them 1 year. Again, the government didn't want to do this. They had to, and they eventually took 2 years, and they had some cannabis grown for them underground by a company. It didn't work very well. People weren't happy. And over the next several years, they eventually issued 38,000 self-supply permits. And again, we fall in that situation where those self-supply permits, great, it was a great looking regime for a lot of people, but you still, for most people who would benefit from medical cannabis, most of those people too, by and large, they've never smoked cannabis. And it's the same for the patient groups in Australia. They've never smoked cannabis. They're never going to need to smoke cannabis. They're never going to need doses high enough that it'll get them stoned. So in Canada, for instance, they issued 38,000 self-supply permits, and people were growing on their own. But still, there was no regime where you could go to a doctor, get a prescription, go to a pharmacy and pick up a dose of what you need. And so that's what's happening there. In Israel, we have a lot of talk from there, and there is some genuine research coming out of there, and Spain for that matter. But in Israel, they've gone a bit more open about it. But if people remember, it's still not quite there. You still can't go to a doctor and get a prescription, and the majority of the medical profession in Israel haven't adopted medical cannabis supply or prescribing it for their patients. And if you have a look at how long they've been doing it, where one of the most noted medical cannabis researchers coming from there over 20 years ago in Israel. So their patient group is about 20,000. You're looking at big groups of privately run kibbutzes with their own palliative care units running patients on medical cannabis. And so it's, again, not where a patient can go and get a prescription and go. The closest place we could really say would be the Netherlands, where there is some kind of a thing where you can go to a doctor, get a prescription and go and get a product or something from a couple of different companies, but Bedra can. And that regime, in fact, is being commented on at the UN level as being kind of okay. It's not been fully approved, but it does mimic as close as possible to the UN drug conventions, which do briefly talk about medical cannabis. So for us here in Australia, we're a long, long way behind, and we've been talking about it for a very long time. What the future is here is still quite onerous, but what has happened, the new wave of medical cannabis interest has been basically around epileptic children. The governments previously, like the Carr government, we had a premier in the past who said it was our duty to get medical cannabis going. Now we've got a premier saying, we'll be the world first. Look, in New South Wales, for instance, here in New South, we've already paid for a bunch of these studies and inquiries. We have found the benefits, and we should look into it more. I suppose what's happening in the meantime now, we've had a lot more talk, a lot more public knowledge, a lot more questions being asked by the public. These parliamentary inquiries that have been run around that have been run in different states have been quite interesting. We're having more politicians asking more questions and confronted with more questions from more members of the public. So in the meantime, I don't think that say in the past 15 years sufficient energy and focus has been put on satisfying what the medical profession want, what the politicians need to show that this is good, and that is those clinical trials and that kind of thing. So while a lot of people have been talking about medical cannabis, while a lot of drug law reformers have focused towards medical cannabis, it is still quite complex, and no one's really got to the top of where that bottleneck is. Again, not for us here in Australia, but for all these people in the world.
Thank you,
all
Andrew.
these countries.
And
So,
thank you. Would you like to finish? We'll be hearing about clinical trials in the next talk also. I believe you'll be in on that one also, Andrew.
I'll just get to the point of it.
Yes,
was that
sorry.
the bottleneck is for here and the rest of the world the lawful source of medical cannabis for trialling, and that seems to be controlled at the very top through the UN and through a very small handful of countries, so companies. So until we can address that, the future is grim.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Torsten, what would you think would be the disadvantages from a consumer's point of view of a system that limits production and distribution of medical cannabis to pharmaceutical companies?
Well, there's two distinct types of users. The first one is probably the naive one who doesn't know about what cannabis does, who goes to the doctor, gets recommendation or from the media. Now they'd want to have a standardized product that's gone through a TGA approved process, as Alex was saying before. Standardized product to one of the active constituents in it. But on the other hand, you have users who, say for example, just want to treat nausea, who would much prefer to pick their own strain. And I don't think the fully approved products will actually help very much with that, because if you look at the dispensaries overseas, people will pick and keep picking different ones until they get the one that works just right for them, and it might take them 20 different strains until they get there. Pharmaceutical companies are only going to produce 2-3 different types of profiles, maybe a THC heavy profile, maybe a CBD profile, maybe one that's equal. But there might be a user that needs it to get to sleep, so you want to have more CBN in it. He may not actually have an approved product available, with that sort of profile. So I think we're only looking at at one type of user with the government approved model. That would go through the TGA.
And Damon, would you say that there are issues that could be a problem if cannabis is only restricted to pharmaceutical dispensary?
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of free access and being able to be self-reliant, I guess. At the moment, if we're sick or we need pain pills, if I need pain pills, I've got to go to the doctor, get a prescription for them, go to the pharmacy, hand over my money, and then they give me my packet of shiny pills and off I go. It'd be great if the pharmaceutical industry could do that with cannabis as well, but we also need the choice to be able to grow our own for those that, like Dawson said, we can't find the profile that suits us for what we need. We might be in a regional area without access to pharmacies or anything like that around. And there's all sorts of different reasons. Pharmaceuticals are going to happen. They've already got their patents out to protect their future drugs and that sort of stuff. The Department of Health in the US has had their patents since 2003 to protect any stuff coming through from there for the Department of Health. So it's going to happen, but whether it happens in a massive industrial scale way or like Torsten said, they just put out 1 or 2 products just to sort of keep their finger in the pie and see what happens with the framework that's happening over in the States at the moment with the dispensaries like Andrew was talking about.
Thank you, Damon. And Ivan, in the context of the current political climate, do you believe there are good reasons for distinguishing between the movement for medical cannabis and the recreational use of cannabis? What would you say constitutes legitimate need for a substance?
Well, in terms of political climate, you really have to look at which political climate. The political climate in Australia is pretty far behind, as been mentioned. I'm Canadian, so I've seen the last decade in Canada and how the medical side of things has really played out. And I think it's important that government gets on board and they sort of classify things and make sure that you get standardized products and whatnot. The U.S. political landscape is a lot different. It's doing state by state. It's interesting to see how that's all playing out as well. Europe's different. I've been doing a little bit of looking into what's happening in the Caribbean and South America. I really like what's happening in Jamaica. I think in terms of they're taking into account that people want to smoke cannabis recreationally, and it's always going to be the case. And so what they've done is they've allowed people to have 2 ounces possession. You're allowed to grow 5 plants. So I think in terms of the title of this talk, we're talking about small farms, and that is letting people grow vegetables, letting people grow medicine, letting people grow their recreation. But at the same time, they're looking at rising up a medical system as well, standardizing products. I believe Jamaicans invented Canosol, or a glaucoma medicine made out of cannabis a few years ago. So I think that in Australia, we get a really good opportunity to look at all these different models that have played out all across the world and cherry pick the best ones as we implement it. Because Australia is a little bit, we need a bit of time to sort of sort it all out.
Would you have any thoughts on what constitutes legitimate use, or what conditions could be considered legitimately medical use of cannabis? There's some gray area there.
In terms of legitimate use of medical cannabis, it has to really rely on the patient and the medical practitioner that's helping that patient. And that that link has to be recognized, across allopathic medicine and naturopathic medicine, and there's a lot of work to be done in terms of regulation and stuff like that. But cannabis is a legitimate medicine. Just have to find the right way to play it out in the recreational and the medical side of things.
Thank you, Ivan. And Torsten, could you comment at all on the current situation with the Richard Di Natale's bill? Richard Di Natale's bill that is before the Parliament at the moment, and no. Well, in that case, could you comment on what you could foresee as an effective legislative approach to the regulation of medical cannabis?
Okay. Well, Richard's bill is very much contrary to what the government is trying to do. So the government at the moment is still trying to have cannabis integrated into the existing TGA model of approving drugs. So first scheduling a drug and then approving single products. Now, Richard is actually trying to bypass the TGA model and set up a watchdog or department that's specifically about cannabis. So you don't have to look at all the restrictions that are currently in the normal pharmaceutical model. What was the second one?
What would you see as potentially effective legislative approach to dealing with medical cannabis?
Look, I think the government's model of trying to go via the TGA can't work because it relies on huge finances. So if you want to get a product approved, you need to spend, for something as risky, as they see it, as cannabis, it'll probably cost like $500,000 to $1 million to actually get a packaged product into pharmacies. Now, that's pretty much impossible for small operators to do. So there's probably going to be a limit to how many companies can actually put out a product, and these will be big companies, pharmaceutical companies that can actually afford to do so. So that will mean that there's a limitation to what strains you can get, what profiles you can get. So most companies will probably jump on the bandwagon of pure CBD and a high THC kind of product. But that completely negates, leaves out the other 80 cannabinoids that could have beneficial effects. So there has to be some sort of process for people to access these other products, because somebody who just wants it for the nausea, for chemo treatment, for example, they don't necessarily want to be stoned off the head for all day. They want a product that will give them the nausea relief without being dysfunctional. The pharmaceutical model isn't going to provide that, so we need to have some way for these people to these patients to access the medicine that they need, and they need to have a much wider choice. At the moment, in the dispensary model overseas, they can go in, they can try the different strains and find one that works. It would be even better if they could actually go in and find single products that work. So like not just a plain herb, but also an extract that's been modified or separated to just bring out one of the cannabinoids that might help them. Now, there's no point having all of that run through the TGA, because ultimately we already know they're safe. We just need to know whether it will work for that person. And for something like nausea, you don't need to have trials and proof. As long as these people feel that they can eat again, that's what you need.
Dr. Wodak, what would you think of what Torsten has suggested there? And would you say there's support for the idea of medical cannabis broadly amongst the medical community in Australia?
Well, look, I'm sympathetic with the view that that the TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, is not the right agency to regulate medicinal cannabis. Not just because of the high fee, although that's a significant factor. The TGA has got a good reputation in terms of international pharmaceutical regulatory, in that area. It's spotted some dodgy pharmaceutical products and prevented them getting the Australian market, and it's also spotted some pharmaceutical that were very valuable and made sure they got to the market quickly. And compared to the comparable body in the United States, the FDA, I think the TGA stands up very well. It's not a problem with the regulatory body, but it's really the difficulty for me of fitting the regulatory culture of the TGA with what is needed to regulate medicinal cannabis, which is very challenging for any standard regulatory body. There's a huge body of knowledge. The body of knowledge, I'm sure this is working. That body of knowledge is advancing very rapidly. It'll be difficult for a regulatory body that is trying to handle hundreds of other applications to also deal with this very complicated area that is so different from all the other products that they are asked to consider. So that's why I'm very supportive of what Richard Di Natale's been proposing through that committee of having an Office of Medicinal Cannabis, and it worked well in Israel, and it's worked well in some other countries as well, having this separate body. And I think everyone in this room will have to be reasonably patient. We're not going to get this right in the next 6 months. It's going to be an evolving process, even when we start doing it. And of course, like everyone else in this room, I wish we'd started yesterday, not tomorrow or next week or next month. It's all too late. But when we start doing it, it's going to take a lot of time and effort to keep on improving the system. The medical system is quite risk averse, and not only for legal reasons, but also philosophically. Medicine, as I'm sure you'll have heard this saying that's allegedly came from Hippocrates, first do no harm. And there's some doubt about whether he actually said that. But in any case, that's very much part of the medical philosophy, that the onus of the benefit of doubt must be given to safety, that medicine would rather not do something that harms people than do something that helps people. If there's a doubt, make sure you don't harm people. That's the philosophy. So that's really what's behind this thinking, and one of the important elements in this is that a lot of the data that people in this hall, for example, would consider very valid have no scientific validity. So whether or not cannabis was used in China 3,000 years ago really is not going to affect a TGA or an Office of Medicinal Cannabis. Whether cannabis is believed to be very powerful and very effective and very safe by many people is not really going to affect the TGA or the Office of Medicinal Cannabis. They will want to see good studies, and one of the difficulties here is that we have a very powerful what's called publication bias, and that is that up until now it's been very, very difficult in most countries in the world to get studies approved by an ethics body. It's been very difficult to get them funded, and it's been very difficult to get botanical cannabis to evaluate. And a lot of the pharmaceutical preparations which have been approved by regulatory authorities, like Dr. Bierman discussed yesterday, a lot of those haven't been very satisfactory. The absorption has been very slow, and because of the slow absorption and the length of time taken between when the medicinal cannabis was ingested and when it had an effect, it was very difficult to titrate the right dose, and as a result, patients often ended up with too little a dose, in which case they didn't get the benefit that they could have got and that they were seeking, or they had an overdose. And for some patients, not for all, for some patients, intoxication is very much an unwanted side effect. And that may be different for people in this hall, may be different for younger patients in general. And it may be that for some patients with severe cancer and undergoing cancer chemotherapy, a little bit of intoxication is actually desirable. But for many people, the thought of a patient getting intoxicated with medicinal cannabis is unattractive. So we have to take all of that into account. It's a complicated area, and I think we have to take heart from the fact that there have been 5 parliamentary inquiries have been conducted, or will have been conducted soon, 5 jurisdictions. A lot of information has come out of those into those inquiries. Not all of it, I think, has been helpful, but a lot has been helpful, and so we're in a much better place than they were a year ago, or 2 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago. It's true, many other countries are much more advanced than Australia, and I think that thought is getting through. This subject, we should remember, has something like 69% community support in Australia, and that was before any effort was made to try and change people's opinion, and the 74% popular support for doing trials of medicinal cannabis. So it's not lack of support, and it's not even lack of political support. We have support across the political spectrum. So I'm relatively encouraged, but it's still a while to go before we get to where all of us want to be.
Thank you, Alex.
Testing 1, 2. Hey, hey. Yeah? Okay, we'll give this a go.
Excellent. And we did start a few minutes late, so we'll hopefully we can run a bit late on this and have time for some audience questions. But I'd like to ask Andrew, can you foresee a system in Australia by which we could have family farms producing medical cannabis?
Not so much sure about family farms growing medical cannabis. I'm still the size of an operation, or the size of a plot that would be needed to grow enough cannabis to satisfy all Australian needs is relatively small in the scheme of things. I mean, we're looking at a handful of acres. You'd be no more than 5 acres. It's a pretty productive plant, and the size of preparations that could be obtained from it are fairly small. If we're talking about like an American model where the whole cannabis green vegetable matter is used as well, it's foreseeable. I can't really see that either in Australia, but I think here in Australia we're really, it's like the doctor was saying, we've had 5 inquiries. I think what's been interesting, I've read a lot of those transcripts and the submissions where we seem to be educating a new bunch of politicians who are running these running these inquiries, and so they're not really taking it further. They're reaching a level of, and they're quite impressed with what they're learning about medical cannabis and who's been involved and who's doing what. But we're not really achieving, asking the real questions. Why is there a hold up on the supply of medical cannabis for research? Why is it happening around the world? I think the regulator of medical cannabis being proposed by Richard Di Natale, or that cross-party group, that's been quite interesting, because we've got a bit of a look into the way that TGA is being run. And they're talking about the very high fee structures, and that those high fee structures are what's needed to run the TGA. So in effect, it's being run by the industry. When you've got companies who are bringing new, a steady stream of new products onto the market, and they're contributing quite a bit to this TGA, and the board and the rescheduling committee that reschedules products that allow them to be studied or be manufactured and developed into products. The TGA is basically run by the pharmaceutical industry, and that was touched on in the inquiry. And so trying to fit cannabis as a whole plant, with all its cannabinoids, into the TGA system is obviously the stumbling block. But the other blaring question was if they're growing poppies for opium and extracting opium, which is not just opium, it's a range of other chemicals and agents in there, but they do the refinements, and we can produce various opiate products. Well, the simple question would be, well, why can't we do the same with, grow a cannabis plant, remove the cannabinoids, refine them, process them, and make a product? That, I think the inquirers aren't educated enough at the base level to take it any further. And when they've got those doctors and people from the medical profession and people, bureaucrats and so forth from the various government departments who are continually able to say, well, we can't do it because cannabis doesn't fit into this or that thing. We can't have a look at it, we can't progress it into the medical system. The regulator, of course, it's like this brain, this idea that's come, well, how about we don't call it, we don't put it into that, we create this other, a regulator that would satisfy or mimic the requirements of the UN Drug Convention, which, again, I mentioned earlier, it briefly talks about medical cannabis, but then refers to have a look at opium. So if a country wants to do medical cannabis or medical opium, you have a look, here's this set of regulations. And the one blaring part of those regulations surrounding opium and, for that matter, cannabis is the one sentence about that a lawful source. A country can do medical cannabis research. It can allow cannabis for medical and scientific purposes. It can, have a regulator, an Office of Medical Cannabis that administers all of that. But as long as it gets its cannabis from a lawful source, and in many ways that's always been the stumbling block around the world. And sad to say that the medical profession here and the inquiries that have been conducted in Australia haven't touched on that. They've come close but not touched it. There have been various representatives from Attorney General's Department who've kind of talked about that. Well, if you're going to have a carer and they're going to grow for, a patient, where is that carer going to get a lawful source of the seed to start it from? So, that plays out, that scenario also plays out and affects, products like Sativex and Nabiximol and its, apparent non-recognition by the World Health Organization, and still not really a licensed product, still finding a lot of obstacles to overcome. What progress has been made primarily has been since one of the big pharma, Bayer, they put a lot of money into this product now and buying into GW Pharmaceutical. They had for a while, but primarily lately in its attempts to get into the US market and meet FDA regulations, there certainly a lot of money being put that way. But ultimately we're looking at Sativex as just a product which is so narrow in its scope, really, for use of spasticity and spasm for multiple sclerosis patients. So whether that would, be good and be able to taken up by other patients who know that it probably could help them in other conditions is still...
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah.
I'm afraid we have to move on to our audience question section because we started late and we're going to run over as little time as possible so the next panel can get started. So does anyone have a question for our panelists?
Yep. Oh, sorry, that's a bit loud. Hello, my name's Karen. I believe that millions of Australians are needlessly suffering, waiting for these trials to be done. And I believe that there's programs being run successfully in other countries. And I think the thing that's blocking it is greed by, I'm not going to mention any names, but people want to make money out of it. I believe this plant was abolished because people can grow and make their own medicine. And that's the way it's meant to be used. And for medicinal, industrial, even recreational, Australians would much rather have a plant growing in the backyard that, the men can, that's their choice of recreational use, that they'd come home and have a pipe with a plant that's grown in their backyard. The women can feed, the raw cannabis is the best medicine. It's incredible medicine, just raw. It's low THC, and it's, it's such a versatile plant. Like I said, it's been successfully used in other countries, I think we should stop stalling because millions of Australians are needlessly suffering.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think this is a very important debate because we've got to this position that we're forgetting, of course, and thank goodness. I mean, cannabis is a plant, and there are so many, as our respected herbalist in town mentioned yesterday in question time. There are so many other herbs that are faced with the same abolition through greed, mainly through greed, and this TGA in Australia, especially control over plants. The only saving factor in the wisdom of the plant is gives humans pleasure. And that's what this debate wouldn't even be here, except that plant gives human beings pleasure. So we not only have the fun police against us, but we also have corporate interests. And this is where the real fight will begin, because we will lose the right to enjoy that herb like we enjoy a beer. Imagine being confined to VB for the rest of your life. You know, and as a chemist delivery boy when I was a kid, I had to go into the pub to get stout, and I was 15 years of age, to take to customers, because back in those days they recommended stout, which of course is made from another herb. What I'm trying to get at is that, thank goodness, that cannabis gives us pleasure, because the debate wouldn't be here. The plant would already be scheduled, as is ephedra, as is lobelia inflata, as is coltsfoot, and the list goes on. When a plant has healing power, greed and the fun police step in, and this is where our fight begins. We need to have boutique growers. We need to have the fun, as in the beer industry, where we can go in and get these craft beers, or we can buy the VB. Let market forces prevail and allow family farms. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I
Thank
just
you.
comment on that? There's some precedent for what you're saying in terms of the complementary medicines, but in terms of the conventional medicines, we don't ask people who want to use morphine to grow their own opium. We don't ask people who want cocaine to be used on them medicinally, and cocaine is used medicinally in Australia and other advanced countries still. We don't ask people to grow their own coca plants. So we're swimming against the tide, running an argument that people should be able to grow their own plants, except in the complementary medicines area. I think it would not be helpful for the future of cannabis as a medicine to have it lumped in with the complementary medicines. I hope it stays in with conventional medicines, because frankly I think that's where it belongs.
Thanks for the debate. It
it's an
doesn't matter if
interesting-
we agree or disagree. It's sorry. Did you want to?
I was just going to, on that, it's, you know, as a plant itself, and when we look at coca and opium, and we're sitting pretty here in Australia, we're growing half the world's opium, so it's not like any legal opium, but in saying that and doing that, and we go back to the original prohibition of cannabis, and it wasn't just a prohibition of cannabis, it was a prohibition of cannabis. But this same group, the nationally INCB, the International Narcotic Control Board, what they did say was that we're going to take opium from the Middle East, and we're going to have a couple of companies grow the lot. They will own it, and they will put it through the TGA, through all the medical departments of every country, and we will have that monopoly on world pain management. They said the same about coca. They said that no country, no farmers anymore in South America will grow coca. There'll be one or two companies, including a soft drink syrup company. And these names, Coca-Cola was all but mentioned back when they got these laws together. And they said, we'll control that, and we'll have a couple of countries own all the coca, and they will supply it. And when they got to cannabis, they just said, no one will have it. We'll say that they can, and they have to get it from a lawful source. but no one. That's what's really happened. In terms of opium, poppies, they recognised, the INCB, they recognised that India, or the Middle East, India and Turkey, those kinds of countries, traditionally grew it for thousands of years. So they put in a token rule, the 80-20 rule, and they said 80% of all the world's, of America specifically, opium, lawful opium, will be grown in these two countries, acknowledging that's where it came from. I think we here in Australia celebrated last year in growing half the world's opium. We took it off them. They also, the same group, the INCB, did a report about the distribution of those pain relieving medicines, and they had a scale of 1 to 10, and 10 being the hardest place to get access to lawful medicines. Guess where it was? It was in the Middle East. The hardest place to get opium, medicines for pain, was in the Middle East now. We've taken, so there's been a big skew. I think Western nations, we use like 92% of all opium medicines in the world. On that side of things, it's really has been a complete failure, a complete and total failure. And in terms of, that's in terms of the distribution of those drugs, and it's just getting worse.
Thank you. Do we have a question?
Yeah, sorry, one question quickly. Thanks for the debate. I'm glad we can all talk about these things and not be afraid to get shouted down. But I just have to do a quick thought experiment to try and clarify something you've brought up. My thought is that you imagine you have a small child and you're going to fly from the Gold Coast to Sydney, and unbeknownst to you, the pilot, he's caught up with a friend, he's quite tired, gets up, got a migraine. We know migraines respond very well to medicinal cannabis. Goes to the cupboard at his friend's house and he sees migraine tincture and says on the back, take 2 capfuls for a bad headache. He goes, oh, I'm a man, I'm going to have 4. Throws them down, and he's going to get on the plane, and suddenly he's feeling a bit nervous. He never really feels nervous. He gets into the cockpit briefing. There's a very big storm on the way, stream hazard. Would you feel comfortable getting in the plane knowing that that man, for the first time in his life, is very, very stoned? Put up your hand if you would. So no one will get on the plane.
Torsten,
no one will
like
get
to
on the
address this
plane.
question.
Exactly, but I'm talking about the first time.
Yeah,
and I
but
think
you-
this is what we have to be careful
It's
of.
a pointless argument because we already have hundreds of medications that do exactly the same thing.
That's my point, and that's
Yeah,
my
if you-
point,
if
because
you-
I think the elephant in the room, and for all of us that want this legalised, is to think about what is the testing that it entails. Because we might have to be willing to be subjected to it if we're in jobs that could be threatened, if our coordination, for example, is threatened. And we, I think, shouldn't be afraid to talk about this because most of conservative Australia, this will be their first argument. How do we make it safe?
It's still pointless because we have medications and plants or medications that come from plants that do exactly the same thing.
So should we drug test all
scopolamine,
our
for
pilots?
example.
Should we drug test
Excuse
all
me.
our pilots? That's my point.
Scopolamine, for example, is a really good example because that's what brought Pan Pharmaceuticals down a few years ago. Scopolamine will, at the wrong dosage, make you go crazy and make you do stupid things like opening plane doors mid-flight. So we already have a model of how to prevent that, because we know what the dosages are, we know what the risks are, and the professions will know what drugs they're not allowed to take.
So
like
that's
different
my
professions have certain drugs that they're just not allowed to
So
take.
that's my second question, because you were really promoting Thorsten, and I think it's great, and that we have family farms, and yesterday Dr. Beardman's talking about the entourage effect and that we need all of these cannabinoids together. And you're probably right that individuals need to be able to find the strain that works for them, but we have to be able to standardise the dose so the pilot who flies knows what he's taking. That's the contradiction, it seems, in your argument.
I'm
to
not
me.
against standardised doses. Okay? I think there need to be products that are standardised, especially for those sort of situations. But there also needs to be other products that people can pick and choose from.
How can we do that cheaply for our community farmers here? Is it
How can we do it
chromatography?
cheaply?
Yeah, like how can we send in samples and get it so...
No,
if it
you
becomes-
do two separate things. So let the big pharmaceutical companies run their standardised products, and have the family farms or dispensaries providing other products. So if you're a pilot, you can't go and just buy some unknown, undosaged, unstandardized product,
gonna
you have
happen.
to go to no, it's
That's what you're
exactly the
telling me
same
will
thing as other medications. You know, if you're a pilot, you have to go and get your scopolamine from the chemist, and you have to know what the dosage is that you're allowed to take. You can't just go into your
So they
garden and
can't
grab
get
a scopolamine
scopolamine
plant.
anywhere else. That's what you're saying. It's only really in the pharmacy.
Scopolamine, it's in lots of gardens.
But would most people know it like cannabis, so they would just go and take it? I see where you're
Oh,
coming from, but it
it's-
doesn't seem to have quite the same risk. But more my question was, and sorry I'm taking up everyone's time, but if it's available in Australia for people who do want to test their strains and do want to know what percentage of cannabinoids they have in them, can it be done? How can we test?
The plants get tested just when you send them into, when your crop comes in, you send them to the university, they can test them for CBDs and THCs.
Yeah,
and
but you've got
Southern Cross University tests.
But you've got
Yeah.
a license, but for most people, no, you can't. The lab itself has to have a permit to possess and do that testing. So if your pot isn't lawful, there's no way that a lab is going to risk its accreditation. It's, you know, millions of dollars worth of machinery and what it can do on that machinery to test someone's illegal cannabis. It's unless you have a permit to grow low THC cannabis, or unless you had a permit like Dr. Catalaris did. Everything is accounted for, and that's how strict it is. But like I was saying, that's the same around the world. And I could, you know, probably should highlight that a lot of the claims of high CBD varieties and such other claims come, you know, that are widely reported on. When you do have a look back and try and trace back what sort of testing is being done and to what extent, in a lot of cases they're not really, you know, it's not proper testing. It's more like, you know, some, you know, at best they're more like a litmus test. So it's the kind of testing that we've done here at the Southern Cross Uni and what's capable in lots of universities is simple to do, but none really do it. It's very rare what happened here in New South Wales at the Southern Cross Uni. But yeah, no lab's going to risk its permit or licence and use their machines to do it, unfortunately. But what you're saying is exactly right, and probably reinforces the argument we're all having here, that, you know, if a pilot needs to use cannabis to relieve a migraine, he should be able to go to a chemist and get a prescription and get it. And more than anything, underlying a lot of this is that the doctor's insurer is willing to cover that doctor in case something happens to that pilot.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm afraid we have to wrap it up. Do we have time for one more comment? Is any member of the panel would like to suggest what should we be doing as Australian citizens and possibly growers to assist with this process moving forward over the next 12 months?
Support the process that's going on in federal parliament at the moment. The bill that Senator Richard Di Natale is trying to push through. I think that's possibly the best thing we can do at the moment.
Yeah, that's pretty much. We need to do a little bit less infighting, a little bit more progressiveness. There's lots of things to talk about with the CBD and the THC and the pharmaceuticals coming in, and whether you'll be able to grow it yourself. But we need to support the people that are up here, the people that are trying to push this thing for you. A lot of us are still trying to work out the do's and don'ts and that sort of stuff, but we need to really come together and support it as one. Otherwise, this is going to take more years and years. We're going to be here in another 20 years talking about 20 years ago when we were talking about it. So let's move.
Excellent. I'd like to thank the panel and thank the audience for joining us here today. Sorry we don't have any more time. Can you please give them all a round of applause?